International Media TV. Television that listens to you.
Hi, I'm Johnnie Burrell. Welcome to the program.
And I remember that Senate Judiciary hearing. I was a lawyer. I passed the bar. And I remembered as if I was in that room with her. My stomach was in knots and my heart was pounding. And I felt like I was there to say, go on.
What would be your message?
Well, I think we need to all know what our options are. But wherever we can send out, what you gain will be worth the trouble. It will not only be a gain for you, but it will be gain for generations that will follow you and an example for black women in the future.
Every day we are seeing more and more people stand up and speak out when they see injustice. Tonight, we're here to celebrate one of those brave individuals who stood up, spoke out, and started a movement. A movement that came to be called the Year of the Woman back in 1992. How fitting it is that we have her join us during this Women's History Month, since she certainly made history not only for herself, but for so many women who were inspired by her example to make history themselves. When Dr. Hill spoke out against the injustice that she suffered, she was not universally praised. Instead, she really was humiliated by a committee of white male senators and had their motivations, had her motivations called into question. Can you believe that? Called into question by them and the media. But she still rose. She still rose. She held her head up high and demanded an acknowledgement that what was done to her was wrong. She didn't let the abuse she was subjected to dissuade her from working to create a world where other young women wouldn't be made to accept sexual harassment as simply a part of their job. She rose and she started a movement, one person. It led to more women being elected to public office and many more accomplishments, which Frida, who will introduce her in a minute, will tell us about. But to the young people in the audience tonight, I want you all to listen closely to what Professor Hill has to say. Each of you has the potential to make an impact like she did. I want you to see that her story is similar to many of yours. Never doubt that the time is right to do what is right as she did, because it's always right. It may seem lonely at the time, but history will be on your side as it was on hers. It was on hers. So Anita, welcome to Oakland, the home of the Black Panther Party. The heart and soul of the resistance movement, the most progressive and diverse congressional district in the country, where my residents and my constituents, they continue to speak out, they don't back down, and they continue to fight for peace and justice each and every day, and they continue to stay woke. Thank you again.
Good evening. It's a privilege of enormous proportion to be on this stage, speaking after Congresswoman Barbara Lee, my rep here in Oakland, we live and work in Oakland, and introducing Professor Anita Hill. Two women of remarkable courage, clarity of vision, strong values, and genuinely warm and compassionate women. I am proud and humbled to know both of them. As Congresswoman Lee said, my job is to introduce Professor Anita Hill. Many may not know her background, so I just want to give you a little bit about her. When Anita is asked who her heroes are, the first person she names is her mother. Anita was born in Lone Tree, Oklahoma, and she may or may not know that I lived 3 years in Oklahoma. She is the youngest of 13 children, and her parents were farmers. Her family came from Arkansas, where her great-grandparents and her maternal grandfather, Henry Elliott, were born into slavery. All 13 of the Hill children were expected to go to college. After graduating as valedictorian from Morris High School in Oklahoma, she enrolled at Oklahoma State University, received a bachelor's degree in psychology with honors in 1977. She went on to Yale Law School, obtaining her JD with honors in 1980. Anita's law school classmates expected her to be testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee one day, but they anticipated that she would be nominated for the U.S. Supreme Court herself. Instead, her strong moral compass meant that she had to tell the truth about the sexual harassment she suffered when working for Clarence Thomas. As Anita has explained it, she had to protect the public from someone unfit to serve and to protect the integrity of the court. In the 26 and a half years since her testimony in October of 1991, Anita has inspired countless people to stand up for justice. During those hearings, I had the honor to be an on-air commentator on NBC with Tom Brokaw, and I listened real time to her testimony. It was riveting. Her grace and integrity and courage were evident in October of '91, but they have characterized her steadily over these many years. I have the honor of working with Professor Hill now on the Hollywood Commission on Sexual Harassment and Advancing Equality in the Workplace. I continue to see that Professor Hill has a remarkable ability to keep her eye on the goal, true equality and equity, to mark progress towards those goals, but also to be clear-eyed about the setbacks and sidesteps along the way. Her perseverance and poise in the face of injustice is remarkable. I've had the great impact to witness her impact on young people, especially young women of color. Congresswoman Lee mentioned some of our programs. This will be the 15th year that we are running SMASH, the Summer Math and Science Honors Academy, a residential program for low-income, underrepresented high school students of color. We started on the UC Berkeley campus. We are now on 7 campuses. We're opening Detroit and Philadelphia this summer. But you're waiting to hear from Professor Hill. I know you will be inspired by her words tonight, as millions have been inspired by her actions and character for nearly 27 years. She is our voice through chaos and community. It's my great privilege to welcome Professor Anita Hill.
Good evening. Wow. Thank you so much. I tell you, I have had a long week, but I feel like in this room with this energy, with all of these wonderful people, that it just began. This is just what I waited for. Now, I have so many people to thank, and I want to start by thanking the young leaders from the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center who gave me a wonderful opportunity this afternoon. Now, at one point, one of the young people said to me, "How do you maintain hope?" And I gave them the answer about how I maintain hope, and that is by thinking about the progress that we have made, not just in my lifetime, but in the lifetime of my parents and my grandparents. But in truth, as I left there, I realized that I maintain hope because of them. They are our hope. And they are here to live up to that and live up to those expectations. And you got a glimpse of it from the ones who were here on the stage tonight. I want to thank the organizers. Roy Wilson and Karen, and I hope that I won't botch your name. Bolke? Oh, okay. Thank you, really, for all of the work you do, but especially for getting me here and allowing me to receive this warm welcome. I want to thank, of course, Frida Caper-Klein for that gracious and generous introduction. And, of course, I'm going to save my last set of thank yous for two incredibly inspired and inspiring leaders from your community. Congresswoman Barbara Lee. The work that you do in Congress, the work that you do on the House floor and really in committees really only begins to tell your value. Your value is not just to the community of Oakland, and it's not just about the bills that you'll pass, but it's the value for all of us around the country of knowing that we have a voice in Washington, D.C., who will speak for all of us. Whether we get a chance to vote for you or not, you will speak for us, and we all are very thankful to have you. And I know you in Oakland are proud to call her your Congresswoman. I was listening to Elihu Harris, and I have to say, we could go home now. Your passion still shows, and I know you've left elected office, but your passion for people still shows. And whatever you do, whether it's a regent, board of directors, board of trustees, and any of the community work you do, reflects that passion. I just know, I feel it, and I also felt it from the warm welcome that you got here tonight. It is an honor to be able to give a lecture in your names. So thank you for having me. Thank you for establishing this lecture series, and it is now up to me to make good on the promise that you made when you gave this series, when you made this offering to the community of Oakland. And I'm going to actually start with a quote, part of a quote that my sister-in-the-law, Ms. Brown, gave. But I want us to think about it because, these last week was someone, I think it was Mr. Harris, who mentioned Women's History Month and International Women's Day, and we've just come off the Black History Month, and right before that we were celebrating Martin Luther King holiday. And so to me, all of those things really come together. Of course I celebrate Black History Month. It is who I am. I celebrate Women's History Month. And of course we all who believe in freedom celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. because we know how precious it is. And so that quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," is something that we all hear. But I'm going to go back to the part and read sort of another part of that quote, which Ms. Brown has already shared with you, and that is, and I'll start it out, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all of us indirectly." And so I arrived here from Bakersfield yesterday, but I know that in fact my journey to Oakland began in 1991 when I testified in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And I want all of us to think about concepts of fairness and equality in this era, in this moment, when we are all weathering the storm of the most recent presidential election. And I want us to consider Dr. King's words, what it means, in fact, to be in this network of mutuality. What does it mean to think about all of us in a single garment of destiny, in particular as it relates to sexual harassment and sexual assault? Now, a few years ago, I wrote a book about the housing crisis of 2008 and 2009, and I situated the book around the housing crisis because, to me, it was a moment in history in which we were seeing devastating losses, financial losses, home losses, lost dreams. And I don't think we've ever really fully taken account of what it meant, that those losses were more than just the financial losses. And they were more than just one-time losses. They are losses that will be spread to the next generation and maybe even beyond. They were loss of hope, loss of dreams, a loss of a sense of belonging. And so I started to consider what home meant. And I came up with this idea that home is, in fact, in its highest sense, a place where we look for safety and security. Home is a place that allows us to grow and develop. And finally, a true home offers us a sense of being in a space where our contributions are recognized and rewarded. We all want to be at home. We all want to feel at home wherever we are, whether we're thinking about home as our residential place of living, or whether we're thinking about our nation as our home. And I am deeply troubled that, in fact, many of us today aren't quite sure whether we can still be at home in this country. We aren't quite sure if we truly belong here, if we're truly safe here. And we know that there are certain communities who are not safe in this time. We also know, though, and I hope you'll bear with me in helping in trying to help you understand that being at home and feeling at home is key to equality. It's key to justice. It's key to freedom in the 21st century. And so, to paraphrase the words of Dr. King, inequality anywhere, even in our residential homes or our workplaces or our schools, is a threat to our individual equality everywhere. Now, tonight, I could be talking about any number of issues. When I talk about home, I could be talking about immigration. And that issue has been raised in the troubling times that we are in now. I could be talking about domestic violence. And we've seen that issue on the front pages of our paper and centered around a story that seemingly was of sanctioning domestic violence and protecting abusers, even in the White House. I could talk about any number of things, but tonight I want us to talk about and think about gendered violence in the forms of harassment, assault, and bullying. And I also want us to think with me about the racial elements of gendered violence in this country. And keep in mind that I believe strongly that violence against any of us is a threat to safety for all of us. So, you know, it is interesting. I know at this point I could sort of just fast forward to, because everyone expects that I'm going to talk about 1991, and I will. And I could fast forward tonight, you know, to that part of the talk about 1991, but I want us to kind of be in today for a moment, because it really is a new day. It's a new day. I also think it's a new and troubling day, but I also think it's a new day for us to think boldly about equality, even with all of the challenges we have. So, but there are conflicts out there. It's hard for us to think that equality is in that sort of upward trajectory and that we're all on the same page. The election of Donald Trump, when it comes to just the issue of gendered violence, we have elected a man who flaunts sexual predation and misogyny as normal. And that moves us into a new space where the public seemingly accepted harassment and predation and assault. Yet in the past year, charges of sexual harassment against people maybe you had never even heard of, like Harvey Weinstein or Matt Lauer, that you probably have seen regularly on your television screen, and Charlie Rose, all of these made headlines when these men had to leave positions of prominence because of their behavior. And it's hard to know when you see those two pictures where this country is. What choices have we made? Where do we stand on the issues of gendered violence? And even today, even though we've seen these prominent men lose their positions, even today, we aren't quite sure if we have turned the corner to making sexual violence and gendered violence something that we refuse to accept. How many of you are absolutely certain today that this country abhors sexual violence? That we are willing to do something about it? So we're conflicted now. Hopefully, by the end of my time here, and I'm not going to keep you all night, hopefully by the end of my time, you will be a little less conflicted, because there is a path. And I think That path, and I'm absolutely sure that path, goes through our understanding of what it means to be caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality, and what it truly means to be and to understand that we are tied in a single garment of destiny. I also want us to think about race, because, as I say, we're coming off Black History Month, it's Women's History Month, and frankly, because I cannot think about I can't think about gender without thinking about race. I was asked who one of my heroes are, and I gave three, actually, my mother was one, but another was A. Leon Higginbotham. And many of you may know him. Many of you may know him as a race man because he wrote a great treatise on race law and race and legal history, which is still in use in law schools today. But one of the things that he said to me late in his life is he always considered himself to be a race man, but he also said in life that he could never talk about race anymore without also talking about gender. And so I have continued to remember those words. So I will not talk about race. I will not talk about gender without talking about both of them. I live them both. And I acknowledge that, and I would say to you, every one of you, you live them both too. You live both your race and your gender, and you may not acknowledge it, but it is true. So, why do I talk about race and gender both in the context of the confirmation hearing? Well, from the beginning, the confirmation hearing of 1991 for Judge Clarence Thomas was about race. It absolutely was about race. When George Bush nominated Clarence Thomas and said that he was nominated because he was the best man for the job, absolutely, no question, we all know that he was talking about trying to cover for the fact that he wanted to name an African American to take the place of Thurgood Marshall. That is why Clarence Thomas was chosen to take the place of Thurgood Marshall, but not just to be a body, but to replace Thurgood Marshall ideologically. So where Thurgood Marshall was the architect of the legal struggle for equality and a proponent of government intervention to redress racism's harms, Judge Thomas was an individualist. He believed that it was time for government to step aside and that individuals were the only way, through individual growth and development, that was the only way to have true equality, that the government's role was not important. And so that, in fact, went to the critical questions of race that we were experiencing in 1991 and that we are continuing to experience today. If you want to think about where we are today in terms of race, if you want to think about how we have a court that in fact can gut the Voting Rights Act in this country, think about that moment in history when we had a president who chose someone for the Supreme Court to get us to the point where government had no responsibility to protect the rights of individual citizens, the government had no responsibility to protect against racial discrimination, even in something as fundamental as voting. So think about that, and then you will understand how different, quite different. The country, we might have been in an entirely different place in terms of voting and political participation had we had a judge with a different philosophy on the Supreme Court when the Holder case came up before the court 5 years ago. But I also want us to think about Justice Marshall in terms of what I started out with, this inescapable network that we are all in. Because I believe that, in fact, the inescapable network of mutuality is not just something that we should feel as part of a community. The inescapable network and understanding us as an inescapable network of mutuality has to be read into our laws. It has to be a part of our best jurisprudence. So the contrast between Judge Thomas and Justice Marshall was individualism versus community. It was clear. And so we are where we are today. Not where we should be, but we are in many ways where we are today because of Justice Marshall's jurisprudence. The advances that we have made in the law on racial issues, ethnic issues, gender identity, ableism, sexual identity hostilities, all of the advances we have made have been enabled by Justice Marshall's thinking and jurisprudence, whether he was as an advocate or on the bench. So 1991 can teach us something about race and about gender. If we are confused and conflicted today about where this country stands on those two issues, we can start with thinking about 1991. And I want to say specifically, I'll just move forward to say in 1991 does not exist in a vacuum. It happened in a backdrop of years of neglect of the issues of gendered violence. We didn't have the Violence Against Women Act. There had never been a full effort, either on the EEOC or the Department of Education, to protect the rights of women. Most of the cases that occurred, or many of the cases that were brought in the federal courts to fight discrimination under Title VII to protect women against harassment, many of those cases were dismissed. Courts routinely dismissed them as personal or private matters and concluded that no violations occurred. The policies that should have been in place in schools and in workplaces didn't exist. And so it's no wonder that women went to work knowing that they were going to confront this problem and just put up with it. They didn't speak up. Now, I will say it's no wonder that most women didn't file complaints. So if you think about the number of women who went to work and put up with the problem, numbers that, it's hard to know because no one even bothered to take surveys, or very few surveys that were reliable existed across the entire public sector or even the private sector. So you think about that number of people who have been harassed and abused in the workplace. Then you think about the number of people who filed a formal complaint. And it really was just a fraction of those people. But there were a few brave people whose names I want you to remember. The first one is a woman named Paulette Barnes. And have any of you heard of Paulette Barnes? Yes, thank you. Great, thank you. But most people have not. Sandra Bundy. Paulette Barnes filed her case, well known as Barnes versus Castle. For those of you who are lawyers, please look it up. You may not have heard about it in law school because even in the 90s, very few of these cases were taught as law that was important. Bundy versus Jackson is another case that you might want to look at. And Michelle Benson. How many of you heard of Michelle Benson? Not enough of you. Google her. But let me tell you something about Michelle Benson. She is the Benson versus Meritorious Savings Bank. She was the first plaintiff to have her case reach the Supreme Court. She prevailed in her case, but let me tell you what she had to go through to prevail. She was a 19-year-old bank teller, trainee in a bank. She had come from a family where she had basically been abandoned, so she had very limited resources. She didn't have support. She took a job, was hired by an individual who she thought and who had, was a leader in his church and a leader in the community. Nevertheless, very shortly after she started working in the Meritor Bank, her boss told her that in order to keep her job, she would have to have sex with him. And the facts show that over the next few years, Michelle Benson, in fact, was forced to have sex with her boss between 50 and 60 times. She left the job, but they refused to allow her to get compensation, workman's compensation, even though she was entitled to it. She left the job as it was, as you could imagine, a stressful place for her to work. She was denied any kind of benefits, and she sued. Took her going to federal district court, to Court of Appeals, and then finally to the Supreme Court to find out, to hear a judge finally say definitively that what she had experienced, the sexual extortion that she had experienced, was in fact sexual harassment. Now, I've given you those names, Sandra Bundy, Paulette Barnes, and Michelle Benson. I also want you to know that all of these women, and many of the women who filed sexual harassment cases early in the 70s and 80s were African American women. So this idea that, we don't have a racial history with this issue is a false idea. I also give you these names because I want you to remember the names. And I say those names because I know I stand on the shoulders of those women. I did in 1991. I still do today, and all of those people who have come since then stand on the shoulders of a Michelle Benson, and as do the women today in the Me Too movement. But for those women, we would not be where we are today. But think about where we were as a country when they came along. Think about the fact that in 1991, we had senators who refuse to look for the facts, who refuse to look for the truth, but in fact were more concerned about their processes and getting to a vote on Clarence Thomas than they were about the integrity of the court. Think about how difficult it might have been when you have elected officials in 1991 in the Clarence Thomas hearing, an elected official who is still in the Senate today, Orrin Hatch, wave a copy of The Exorcist to show that somehow maybe I had made up my testimony or that I was demonically possessed. You had senators relying on misogyny and mistruth, and I say their own set of alternative facts, to pass judgment on the character and fitness of a Clarence Thomas for the lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. You had Senator Danforth, who proposed that perhaps I was suffering from erotomania as the reason for my testimony. And their message was clear. Women who come forward are malicious or they're crazy. And that's what we had in 1991. So you can imagine what Michelle Benson had to go through. Not just the court hearings, but the court of public opinion and the dismissal of officials who should have been embracing her. Now, let's turn a little bit to race now, because we also had the senators failing to call 3 women to testify about behavior that they had experienced at the hands of Clarence Thomas. Now, then this is where intersection comes in. It wasn't just that they were 3 women, but they were also 3 African American women. And then finally you have Clarence Thomas talking about the high-tech lynching. And the high-tech lynching metaphor was something that will live, as they say, in infamy. He claimed it was a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks who in any way deigned to think for themselves or do for themselves or have different ideas. And through this appropriation of history and racial stereotypes, Thomas was able to portray himself as a man unjustly accused and a victim of racism. And why was he able to do this? Because we had representatives who did not understand the racial history of this country. They did not understand the gender history of this country and the racial violence, or excuse me, not only the racial violence that had been experienced, but the gendered violence. They didn't understand that, in fact, there was never any evidence of any African American man being lynched on the words of an African American woman. It was ahistorical. But they were willing to go along with it in part because they did not, and Thomas was able to argue it in part, because they didn't understand the fact that we were tied together, African American men and women. And so they were willing to dismiss one of us, and of course, I was the one. But it wasn't just that they dismissed me, it was that they dismissed the stories and the experiences of all of us. All of us. When Senator Simpson said that I would be facing real harassment for coming forward, when he dismissed sexual harassment as crap, he was not only telling me to shut up, Simpson was silencing all victims. And at that point, what the message was to victims of sexual violence was that the government that you have elected doesn't care about your experiences. What it was saying was that we are not a part of the community, the political community, that they recognize. That we did not matter. I had testified because I believe that my experience mattered. It mattered not only to me, but it mattered to the integrity of the court. And today we are faced with the same kinds of questions. People ask me, they say, well, you know, what are we supposed to do when we have an individual who is running for office, and let's say, for example, a Bill Clinton. And we know that they are bad on certain behavioral characteristics, but we think they'll make good policy. So what do? I say we get better candidates. We get candidates who are not morally compromised and who will not be compromising our political choices, who will not be squandering our goodwill, who we will not have to apologize for when we vote for them. And we are at that moment now when we can support a whole new slate of candidates who can come to us and say, I so believe in the equality of women that I carry that through every aspect of my life. There may have been a time when we had to excuse and assume that sexual predation was just something men did, and especially powerful men did. But that day has passed. And for those who say nothing has changed since 1991, I say you're wrong. Because in 1991, there would not be a hall full of people applauding that line. So what are we to do? I know things have changed, but certainly not enough has. And I could list you many of the things that have changed. But I also have to be honest with you, and I have to tell you that we still are dealing with figures of between 1 and 3 women, or 1 out of 3 women between the ages of 18 and 34 say they have been harassed on the job. And few will report that behavior, and even fewer will file a formal complaint, as maybe even as low as 5% file formal complaints. And when they do file complaints, we still have numbers that suggest that as much as 60% of them will be retaliated against. The harassment of tipped workers is something that has been well documented. Workers who make minimum wages, even below minimum wages, and have to rely on tips, also have to put up with being pinched and kissed and touched without their approval just to get up to that living wage. There is this effort in the public discourse to just sort of live with it, accept sexual predatory behavior as something that men do. And there's we could see why people might do that, because sexual harassment is so prevalent. But just because something is prevalent doesn't mean it is normal. And it certainly doesn't mean that it has to be. But in order to make sure that everyone knows that, we have to punish people who behave badly, who misbehave, even if we say, well, they're good people. Even if they're people who we think are our friends and who might agree with us, we still have to show that our agreement around sexual violence is stronger than our individual friendships. We must also realize, and I hope this little glimpse into history helps us to realize, that harassment victims come in every class, race, age, shape, color, sexual identity, religion, and any other identity factor that you can name. It's about abuse. It's not, as they would have you believe, about sexual attraction. Now, I say that it doesn't discriminate, sexual harassment doesn't discriminate, but I would also say that harassment affects people differently. There are racial elements to the effect, where some women do not want to come forward because they do not want to shame the race by admitting that they are victims, or they don't want to shame the race by admitting that they have been victimized by somebody of their own race. But there are other elements that we have to be mindful of as well, and that is class. Even today, there are women whose wages are so low, whose economic stability is so tenuous, that they dare not speak out against the abuse they experience. They can't afford to. And it doesn't matter how many women they see come forward. They cannot risk losing a job and putting their families in peril by stepping up and complaining. So we are not there yet. And there's one or two other factors that I want us to consider that makes me understand that as much as we say we have come forward, we still have some things that we need to address in order to get where we need to be. Last year, Georgetown Center on Poverty and Equality issued what I call a chilling report. It's called Girlhood Interrupted, the Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood. The School Center on Poverty and Inequality detailed data showing that adults view black girls as less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers, even as young as 5 years old. So what does that mean? It means that, and this is their interpretation, that compared to white girls of the same age, survey participants perceive that black girls need less nurturing and support, were more independent, and knew more about adult topics, including sex, than their peers. And to their authors, this meant that black girls these myths about black girls potentially contributed to the disproportionate rates of punitive treatment in education and juvenile justice systems. So if you think that a child doesn't need nurturing, doesn't need protection, you are more likely to punish her. And that's another indication of this sort of racial gender divide that we see. But I even see the repercussions as more extreme, even broader. I see these perceptions will feed into the treatment of women in the adult justice system. These notions can impede black girls and women's willingness to seek help from the legal system if we believe that the legal system is not there to help us and protect us. And they are less likely to be believed when they do. And there is clear evidence of that as well. So think about what that means even today for the chance of a black girl to get a fair hearing and be taken seriously when she raises claims of sexual harassment in many of our elementary and junior high school in this country. We have a long way to go again to get beyond our racist and sexist notions. And right now, we are not there yet. And the consequences are dire. Black and brown women are the fastest growing demographic in the prison population today. And according to the MacArthur Foundation and a Vera Institute co-published report, this development can be traced back to trauma, including sexual and domestic violence in the lives of people going into prison. So sexual violence has consequences that we are only beginning to comprehend. Sexual violence has consequences to the individuals who experience them, but the consequences don't end there. For those who really believe that what affects one of us directly affects all of us indirectly, you must be concerned about this problem that has plagued women throughout history and that continues today and seems to even be growing. And we must not only just be concerned to think about it, but we have to begin to act. So how do we begin to act? I know that there is legislation being pressed in our federal Congress. I also know that the state of California is considering legislative action. So what do we do if, in fact, we believe that we are caught up in this inescapable network of mutuality, that we are, in fact, tied in a single garment with sexual assault victims? What do you do as voters? Well, the first thing that you do is that you talk to your representatives. And I know you don't have to talk to Barbara Lee because she knows. But talk to your representatives in Sacramento. You should call, email, write. Tell them that this has to be a priority of our society because it is something. This problem is hurting all of us. You should also share your stories. And that's a difficult thing for some people to do, even today. But there is nothing more liberating, not only to yourself, but to younger generations, than hearing and sharing the stories of what it's really like to live and work in an environment where women are routinely demeaned and abused. If we don't tell those stories, they will never be heard, and we can never put a lie to the story that society tells us that these things just don't happen. We've got to break this culture of silence. And sharing stories helps that. We can support the sharing of stories of others who come forward. Last night I was at an event, and one woman said that not only should we be sharing our stories, but we should be sharing the mic to let other people who have not been heard tell their stories as well. So we have to be the models of what we want our young people to be. If we can't come forward in my age and talk about what it means, how can we expect another generation will be? Now, I just ask you, what does it mean to be caught up in a network of mutuality, to really believe that what affects one directly, it affects all of us indirectly? What does it mean in terms of sexual violence? Everybody in this room has to answer that question for themselves. What motivates you to move will be different from me. I was motivated because I saw a nominee for the Supreme Court who had in fact put himself above the law that he was sworn to protect. And I spoke up. People ask me if I had it to do all over again, would I do it, given the treatment that I experienced? And I have never wavered. The answer is yes, I would do it again. What I had to say mattered, and maybe they didn't understand that it mattered. Maybe they understood too well in the Senate that it mattered. But I would do it again. And all of the years have not been easy. And I could have turned back at any point and said, I'm giving up on this. But I believe that I stayed in it to see this moment that we are experiencing right now. And I am in it to stay. And I have also, I know Congresswoman Lee had a mentor when she was going into politics. And so I would just like to say that at this point, even though I didn't know Shirley Chisholm, she has mentored me from the words that she has said. And so I will paraphrase the words of Shirley Chisholm to show where I am today. And that is, when it's all over, I want to be remembered as a woman who lived in the 21st century and who dared to be a catalyst for change. And I invite you to be that catalyst for change in whatever way you can. We can make a difference in this world. We can turn this corner at this point and at this time, and the moment is now to stand up against the violence that we have too long accepted as normal and the status quo. We can do this. Thank you. Thank you tonight. It can start right here.